right, thanks so much, Ruth. Okay, so I am hoping that the talk yesterday set you up to think of some questions that you might want to ask our esteemed panel. And to get started, I actually want to ask each of them to do a quick introduction to their areas of standardization and their communities. So, Yulia.
Thanks. So my name is Yulia Startsev. I work at Mozilla. I'm also a delegate for Mozilla at the TC39, which is the standards body that Jory introduced yesterday. And I am also one of 3 co-chairs at that standardizing body.
Great to be here. Wendy Seltzer. I am strategy lead and counsel to the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, and we do voluntary consensus standards for the web platform.
And today is the W3C's
25th anniversary.
Yay! Happy birthday, W3C!
This is why you're in the middle.
Hi, I'm Parecki. I work at Okta, and I have been involved in W3C as well as IETF. I do some work on OAuth there, and also the co-founder of the Indie Web community and network on standards there as well.
And I'm Natasha Rooney. I work at GSMA, which is a telecoms association. My experience is in W3C, IETF, and some telco standards bodies too.
All right, so quite a bit of experience on the stage. And, in addition to, those groups, we also have folks here from like WhatWG and other probably standards communities. So I think there's quite a lot going on in these spaces. And a question I think I get a lot is like, how do you discover where different work is happening, and are these groups collaborating with one another? So I thought it might be interesting if we started chatting about how our groups are collaborating and what they're working on. Wendy, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, W3C thinks of our work at the application layer, so we do a lot of liaison work with IETF and the protocols underneath that. We also, more recently, are working with the What Working Group, which is doing the HTML standard. And we had a little bit of a challenge initially, as there were 2 versions of the HTML spec, and there were some incompatibilities between them, and we decided that wasn't a way for the web to work. The web demands compatibility and cooperation, and so last year we formed a memorandum of understanding with the What Working Group. So the What Working Group has the HTML and DOM specs, and W3C has a cooperative relationship with that, with our HTML working group helping to feed input and reviews and comments into the work. Both of us have similar work modes. We work in GitHub, they work in GitHub. W3C has a strong tradition of web for all that includes horizontal reviews, security, privacy, accessibility, and internationalization. And so in working with What Working Group, we want to share that knowledge and the input of the broader web community with that group, which is starts by being browser implementer focused and also welcomes the broader input.
Yeah, and so you raised a good point about sort of like that review process and kind of sharing this sort of oversight of certain pieces of work. Are there examples in your areas that you can think of where that happens between the groups?
Sorry, there we go. I was going to sort of build on what Wendy was saying related to IETF and W3C a little bit more. More traditionally, in sort of standards bodies which are a little bit older, there's usually a liaison, and that liaison's usually either a person or sometimes a letter that gets sent between standards bodies to say, we're working on this thing. And I think 3GPP did this, which is a telco standards body related to 5G standards. They sent an email to IETF to say, we're doing this now. So it's a little bit better in internet and web standards bodies. And I think WebRTC is probably one of the greatest examples there. WebRTC involved a lot of standards at the protocol layer and on the web. So there's a working group in W3C and some groups in IETF. And although not both sets of people go to each other, there's sort of a core group that will go to both. So I find that's where the best collaboration happens, where you've got sort of this core group of people which are dancing between both standards bodies and carrying things on. It's a little bit more cohesive than that standard old liaison method.
Do you find that that also ends up influencing the work and the processes of your groups?
Yes, some good, it's best when good practices get carried over. So I can't remember who started the GitHub thing, but there was, I think actually W3C was quite forward in doing this. I don't know about the other standards bodies, but mostly W3C and IETF. And then IETF picked up a lot on that kind of GitHub usage. I'm not talking specifically about GitHub, but how the collaboration on that started to happen. Issue development, labeling, conversations, collaborations, and brought that into IETF. And so I think it happened because of those core individuals were dancing between these two groups. So yeah, it does happen.
We also sometimes have something that happens, which is spec layering. So we have people who are communicating across standards bodies. So TC39 has liaisons from the CSS working group and from WHATWIG and other places. But it's also interesting when we are actually working with a technical question. Recently we had this with built-in modules where part of the work was actually being worked in the WebIDL repository, and this would be a layering situation where it would be implemented in WebIDL, and then TC39 would come on top of that. So that's also an interesting mode of collaboration that happens across standards bodies.
Kind of getting back to GitHub and sort of that evolution of the process of making standards from more paper-driven letters and things to, kind of open source style development practices. I think W3C has been pretty on the forefront of that. There's quite a few tools and, repositories and stuff. TC39 also has kind of recently kind of been leading the way in some of this. I'm curious if you want to talk a little bit about some of the process we're doing there.
Can you repeat the question? I missed
Oh, yeah, I was curious if you wanted to talk a little bit about the TC39's process on GitHub and that kind of thing.
Right, so we have a pretty well-defined process. I wasn't sure if we wanted to talk about how we're trying to open up the process or specifically the process document that we have. So we have a public document under tc39.es/process if you want to take a look. And that outlines the process that we've agreed to. So TC39 is an unusual standards body in that we operate on consensus, and this isn't just most of the room agrees. In our case, it's the entire room agrees, and in this case, consensus also means something a little bit more subtle. It's more that we don't have a specific block against a feature. And we work through 4 stages, starting with stage 0, the straw man proposal, which is, it could be any idea. Anyone can propose a proposal to the TC39. And it gets presented to the committee. We discuss if we want to do some more work in it, which would lead us into broader discussion about what this feature would mean and represent. That's stage 1. From stage 2, we move on to from stage 1, we move to stage 2, where we're doing more detailed design work around the process. Once the design has been settled and agreed to by the committee, we move on to stage 3, which takes us into implementation and getting feedback from users based on the implementations. Finally, once we have at least 2 implementations and we have agreed and taken whatever feedback comes from this stage, we move on to stage 4, where it's considered part of the specification.
I had a question actually. How does TC39 deal when you don't have consensus?
So that's a really interesting question, and usually what happens is we would go and discuss further. Like if someone blocks a proposal, then we would discuss further and see if we can work around the constraints that this person is presenting. This usually happens when a delegate has an invariant in mind, something about the language that they believe very strongly shouldn't change. For example, it might be a specific performance concern or something about usability that should not change. And they may block. This kind of a block usually comes at stage 1 or stage 2. Sometimes we can get around it, and sometimes we can't. When we can't, usually the proposal is stopped. However, we do see resurgences in proposals, like reimagining of ideas and things like that.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Anna.
So this is really fascinating. I'm learning a lot about this because this is so very, very different from the way that both the OAuth working group and the IndieWeb community work, which are very much more sort of bubbling up, ground up, where people just sort of throw something out there and then see what sticks kind of thing. And I feel like in the OAuth group, I see a lot of different people working on different things in parallel, and not so much of a like, we are all building this one thing, but we're all building many small things together. And the same with the IndieWeb community, where anybody can just sort of show up, propose an idea, and it's not like you're bringing it to this committee, you're just bringing it into the community and seeing if anybody else is interested and willing to actually build it.
So that is interesting also, because often we do have multiple proposals, but we also have sort of themes that organically develop in committee. For example, class-based proposals, things like this. So that is an interesting thing that happens in TC39.
I think in W3C, we also see, a lot of work lately coming in through community groups, and we have the Web Incubator community group, and then a whole range of topic-specific community groups where people gather. Anyone can propose a community group, anyone can propose an idea, start building it, start speccing it out, and then bring it forward to a working group to put it onto the recommendation track. And we as W3C team and the community sort of evaluate what's the interest. Do we have something that's likely to lead to multiple interoperable implementations, which is one of the sort of necessary criteria for building to a W3C recommendation? Do we have enough interest from different parts of the community to make those implementations successful and useful? Go ahead. Let's put that on the rec track and see what we can make of it.
So I'm curious if we see, based on kind of this quick discussion of the different processes here, common challenges between groups on standards making here. Like obviously decision making is one. Do you guys want to address challenges here?
I think that's one of the reasons why I asked the question previously, is developing standards on consensus is the right way to do it, but it does make things very slow. And so if you have people who are disagreeing, it can draw things out a lot. W3C, I have seen this happen, but it's in a little bit of a better place. In IETF, this is quite prevalent at the moment because there's been a large amount of work going forward to push security and encryption onto the internet, and that's sometimes met, some companies have come in with some ideas which have kind of combated this a little bit, and so there's sort of the decision making around this gets dragged out a lot because of that, and work gets delayed because of that. That causes people to get frustrated. So it's a tough thing. I think both standards bodies do have some methods, something written in the process document for voting. So if there really is no way that you can get consensus, there is a voting fallback mechanism, but I've seen it used incredibly rarely in W3C, a little bit more in IETF with their harming methods that we were mentioning earlier.
And the W3C has now kind of taken on an initiative that I know you worked a bit on, which is that process for busy people and a new process 2020 document. What is it like to revise process? Because that's sort of like the meta, right?
I wrote the process document for busy people, which I'll link in Twitter later, because I did a tenure on the AB. I was on the advisory board for a couple of years, which is a group at the W3C which looks after the process document and some of the running of W3C. And one of the things we do is look after that process document, and it's impossible to read. Even for a person who has English as their first language, it's so difficult. And it was a very simple document that then sort of bits got plonked on top of it, so it became this monster. And so we revised that for it to be easier to read and in simple English. I was very proud because one of our colleagues who is Japanese translated it into Japanese. It's a hard thing to do with a sort of this is not a legal document, it's a simplification of a legal document, but I was proud about that. There is a great deal of work going on now with some very intelligent individuals to completely redo it and incorporate some very large pieces of work like Evergreen Standards, or I think the name may have changed recently. Yeah, go ahead, Wendy.
Well, we face the tension between sort of agility and stability. Do we want standards that keep up with the tip of development in, the most advanced implementation, or do we want standards that you can refer to for a place that the platform is and will be for a period of time? And, different people want different set points there. So we've been working on a process for sort of continuous development, we're now calling it, to build in some of the reviews and some of the patent commitments. W3C has a royalty-free patent policy that assures that anyone can implement a W3C spec without facing patent royalty demands from anyone else participating in spec development. So we want to incorporate those things into a continuously evolving document rather than saying it's only when it gets to recommendation at the end of the line that all of those assurances come in. And so that is a fundamental change to the way the process has worked, and requires lots of different elements to work together. We need to get the engineers and the lawyers talking together to make this process evolve effectively.
A nightmare scenario. I'm just kidding. We've been focusing a lot on these kind of formal groups, but I want to ask Aaron about process and decision-making and community building in sort of those IndieWeb/open source spaces.
Yeah, we do have a process as well for the specs that work through the IndieWeb community. It is much less strict, and there's no timelines involved. Yeah. It's all just sort of, I guess the idea is to get to something that is, we don't ever consider a spec final. We kind of treat everything as ever evolving because it's meant to document the reality of the world rather than trying to be like a declaration. Mm-hmm. But we do have, we mostly follow the microformats process, which has been written up. It has changed over time as well. We've gone through iterations on that in terms of what exactly it entails. But process does have to be written down, otherwise it is just going to be chaos. So. Yeah,
for sure. And then we were talking about how this also slows that process can really be very slow moving. With the IndieWeb approach, it can move a little bit quicker, right? I think TC39 is a little interesting because of the way we do the yearly standard, and I wondered if you wanted to talk about that.
So it is interesting because we have a rolling standard. We release whatever work we've done up to a certain point in the year as Ecma 2020. So everyone can now make the joke, everything is in hindsight is 2020. But we do have a rolling spec, and the idea isn't that each year we come out with a new spec. It's really that we release the results of our work at that point. It's also interesting how this rolls into the staging process, because at stage 3, we're essentially sending a signal to implementers that it is now safe to implement, because we will not be making significant design decisions at this point. So I think that's another interesting thing, just going back to your point about stability and agility. We want to be able to change our minds and address problems that come up with specifications, but at the same time, we need to also give a strong signal that it's safe to start investing in sometimes implementing some very complex proposals. So it's also a balance of those things. And yeah, just to round that back to our rolling release schedule, it's sort of a point at which we make official that this is a recommendation from TC39.
So learning all of these different processes, as we've been mentioning, is really, really difficult, right? W3C process document is a monster. It's really hard for newcomers to learn. I'm curious what different organizations are doing to sort of make process more knowable, make it more agile, make it more responsive to the way people want to work, like the more IndieWeb way, I suppose.
So I think one thing that's interesting coming from TC39 is our How We Work initiative, which was partially based off of the work that Natasha did with the the process document for busy people, where we tried to write down our process and all of the culture around making standards at TC39 in a GitHub repository that's available and accessible to everyone who wants to take part in that. And also, part of that was releasing a website that's geared towards developers rather than people who are already feeling comfortable working with spec language. Because spec language is this weird space where it's semi-legal, very abstracted language, for good reason, I think, also.
I think that's a big part of it, which is I don't even necessarily see that finding the process is the barrier here. I feel like feeling like you can be part of the process is the barrier, because yeah, spec language is such a obtuse way of describing something, and it's not how you're going to go and learn the concepts behind what's going on, what's being described in the document. And yeah, it is for good reason. It is for good, it serves its purpose that way, but I think you need to have that other way of presenting the ideas more focused to people who are going to be writing the software and writing software using the technology. And I think that is a big challenge of like, how do you make that, let people know that that is something they can participate in and actually get involved in the development of the standards.
There's a lot that standards bodies can still do in this area. I had some unbaked work, which is more sort of getting people up and running on W3C, which I should revisit. One of the things that helped me as a new person within standards bodies was finding a mentor that was, and it wasn't that I asked, will you be my mentor? There was just a few extremely helpful individuals that really started to help. So if you are interested in getting involved, that was my number one thing. And actually within W3C specifically, there was a Mozilla employee who became my mentor, was co-chair of my working group, co-chair of my interest group, and has been a long-standing mentor for me within W3C. So that's a big tip if you're getting started.
And I think the W3C has started to kind of experiment with buddy systems for TPAC and other sort of events, which is positive.
Buddy systems and co-chairing. Chairing is a hard job, and it's 365 days a year, so don't ever chair by yourself. Don't do that. It's a tough gig. You will be in your swim outfit on a teleconference call on a beach. It's just not fun.
Never chair.
So a co-chair really helps, and especially somebody who has a different skill set or different level of experience to you, and then eventually you will be that person who has that experience mentoring your co-chair. So that's W3C is doing that now. IETF has been doing that for a long time. Yeah, it's a good route.
Are there other resources y'all can think of? I think one we've been experimenting with, it's it's baking right now, is outreach groups for TC39. I don't know if you want to mention.
So one thing that we've noticed at TC39 is it's often hard to bring people in and get their feedback. So we've started directly reaching out to specific groups. For example, we have an outreach group for educators, an outreach group for tools and frameworks, and we go to them because we can be a little bit intimidating to talk to. And the goal there is to make sure that we get a broad view on how people are understanding our proposals, what places are our blind spots, what we're not seeing. And these take the form of monthly or bi-monthly telecom calls. So that's something that we've been trying out.
Yeah, I think W3C both, takes in ideas from the community, and so some of the innovations that we've seen recently, moving to GitHub was spurred by community members saying, this is where we do work, and let's not use Mercurial or CVS checkouts anymore, but frame our spec development through issues and pull requests in GitHub. And that's moved to most of our working groups. We now do almost all of our work in public, available to anyone to watch and participate in the discussion. And then we need membership for the patent commitments at the time that you're trying to contribute to spec development. So we get from the community the idea of explainers, and so it's not just the process, but sometimes the technology in a spec itself can be difficult to parse from the spec. So an explainer written in simpler language of what are we trying to do here? What will success look like? What's required to make this API or feature effective? Goes into an explainer, and somebody else who sees that meeting a business use case can add, even if they don't have the technical knowledge of what it would require to fix that, getting a broad sense of the demand for a fix can help spur others in the community to think about what would it take to address that need from web developers, from app developers, web apps, and then another piece that's sort of relatively stronger in W3C is the role of the team. We have a large team of technical experts, team contacts, who are there to help in making it a useful forum. And so if at any point you're trying to get engaged with a W3C group and can't figure out, is this right, feel free to reach out to the team contacts. We're there to help steer you in the right direction.
That raises a good question to me. So W3C is this group that has quite a bit of staff and management and that sort of stuff. What about the other groups? Do you have, are there management, is there a parent org that, helps with any of this, or?
The IndieWeb is complete opposite. It's just individuals working on stuff together, and there is no, we're not even officially an organization. We're just a community with a website. It works.
Do you pay for the domain? I'm sorry. Somebody Patreon him, somebody.
Was that the where does the money come from question?
Well, Jeremy Keith asked me to ask, where does the money come from, but I think we can have a more nuanced conversation about participation.
I can give some info on IETF.
Yeah.
It's a non-membership organization, so if you want to participate in internet standards, you can just do that. It's a tough crowd, though. They're up on their tech. And I learned this the hard way. If you go with a half-baked solution, you're gonna have a bad time. So I'll tell you about my bad time later. It was rather emotional. But yes, it is a tough crowd, but there's no financial barrier to taking part. They have 3 meetings a year. The rest of it's done over email. So and their remote participation for the meetings is very strong. I've actually thought they've done some very good work in making it very accessible to people if you're not able to travel. The money from IETF comes from a few different sources. With the 3 meetings that they have a year, there is an attendee fee. I believe they also get some money from one of the large internet bodies as well. Yeah, exactly.
And Ecma, Ecma.
You know as much as I do on this topic. So we are part of Ecma International. We're a technical committee of that standards body. And so they do have an exec-com, which Jory is part of. And there is a General Assembly meeting where they discuss the work of all the standards bodies, but they've also given TC39 sort of a very free rein. We've been given a lot of freedom to determine our process and how we work. And they've also helped us define our legal relationship with individuals who contribute things to the specification, because this can be rather hairy. For example, in some cases in the US, you'll have a company that says work that you produce on your free time is licensed to the company. As a result, we need to make sure that we're in a good legal position that we can say that if someone implements the TC39 recommendation, then they are legally allowed to do so. And that's an important legal protection, which is, I think, part of the reason that we have the membership structure that we do. So our membership structure is tiered. We have ordinary members. I believe they're associate members. There's another member who, I think they're small business members, and then finally NGOs. And they have different tiers depending on what the funding requirements for Ecma that year are.
I think you raised an interesting point, which is the impact of IPR on our groups and on our processes. Wendy, as our legal counsel on the thing, do you want to kind of maybe advise a little bit on that, on the importance of that?
Well, I have to give the standard lawyer's disclaimer that I'm not the room's legal counsel, but I think we see a variety of approaches to IP. The primary concern tends to be patents. Nobody wants to be writing a specification only to find out afterwards that somebody claims patents on it and demands royalties from anyone who implements or uses the technology. So different organizations have different requirements. Some have a disclosure requirement. If you have or are aware of patents, you need to disclose to the org, and the org maintains a record of those disclosures so that would-be implementers can review to determine their own sort of risk level and comfort with negotiating with those patent holders. Others have so-called RAND, reasonable and non-discriminatory license terms, where the patent holder can charge royalties so long as it's the same royalty to everyone, and so long as it's reasonable, which is something that would have to be determined in a court of law if the parties can't agree among themselves what a reasonable payment is, and all the way to royalty-free, which is W3C policy. That's saying anyone who participates in the group commits that any of their so-called essential claims will be available royalty-free. So anything that is necessary to implementation of the spec is available royalty-free. Things that are optional features or extra add-ons can still be licensed, which opens up a business model of you allow everyone to use the standard, and you sell enhancements. And companies do that, and that's both a motivation to participate in the standards work, get the core standard deployed everywhere, and then convince people that you who know the technology are best positioned to add enhancements on the edge, and if you want to pay for that performance upgrade or that additional feature, then there might be a royalty involved.
So I think this tees up a question from Tantic fairly well, because that's certainly accurate for what you just described as sort of the standard practice for standards in other industries, right? But we're on the web and we value the open web. So the question is, what are things that our standards groups are doing to make the standards process more open? Like, how are we making it more accessible? How are we making open standards, licenses, things like that, more modern and open compared to the standards of yesteryear?
I'll start. I think we work both the royalty-free and the copyright licenses to permit anyone to download our specs. Many of our recent specifications at W3 use a forkable license that is not using copyright as a restriction on who can do other things with the license, with the specs. So if you think we're doing a bad job, you can take the work elsewhere, and we need to convince people that this community is the best place to keep doing the work, because we don't have the legal cudgel to stop them from taking it elsewhere.
With regards to sort of document creation and emails on IETF, the mailing list on IETF and W3C are open. You can find them and read them. Sometimes it's a little bit obscure to get there, but they are available. And you can see document creation from the beginning. Some people will start to work on documents in editor's drafts in their own GitHub repository, but once it reaches the IETF or the W3C, these documents are available to read from whilst they're being worked on. That happens freely, and it's so adverse to how things are done in the telco space. In telecoms standards bodies, you need a login to access things. You need to be a member, so you can't really see anything. In some cases, you have to pay to read the standard when it is done. So it's so different, this industry, and it's really great to see that movement.
I think that was actually one of the things that I was really pleased with getting involved in the IETF and the OAuth working group, was that I kind of just sort of stumbled into it by finding the mailing list, finding the people there, starting having conversations, and then realized that I was I was participating. That was it. I had already joined.
Oh, I'm sorry about that.
But no, I think it works really well having all that happen so out in the open.
But to your point, it's something you kind of have to either go actively searching for or stumble into, and that's sort of a barrier in many ways. Another, for people getting involved, another thing that I've heard that prevents people from joining is sort of that reputation for these spaces being kind of hostile. And, that's not great. What are some of the things that our groups are doing to change that culture?
In the indie web community, we have, so everything is out in the open. Everything is, CC0 license. Everything is in public, and we also have a code of conduct where you are expected to follow it if you are participating in this community, and we hold people to that. And it's a very core part of it. And the goal is, to help create a space that people feel welcome to participate and join. And I hope it works.
Yeah, speaking of the code of conduct, since you sort of were a driving force for that at TC39, can you talk a bit about ours?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of people don't know, but we did about 2.5 years ago at this point adopt a code of conduct for TC39, the delegates that attend the committee. And that was really important because we were certainly getting a lot of feedback and certainly a reputation that it was a fairly hostile place. And we had some really stressful moments. I'm really proud of how the committee has sort of turned around in terms of, being willing to take that step, which is a hard thing to do when we're a consensus-based group. So we had to get 60 plus people to agree to that, some of whom had a problem with that, but that's fine because now we're moving on. And it's been a really nice change. I think slowly we've started to see more of the conversations kind of temper down, people apologizing, thanking each other, like that kind of thing, and kind of really resetting the tone for professional conduct, which is great because that's what we need. I know Wendy and...
Yep, W3C has a code of ethics and professional conduct, and a group that is working on revisions to that to improve the welcome there. We also have had sort of recent introspection and work on diversity scholarships for our TPAC meeting to help people to attend and to recognize that our community is not as diverse as it could be. There are underrepresented voices. There are people for whom it's more difficult to get the travel funding together, and so thanks to Dan Appelquist at Samsung for helping to spearhead that initiative. We've had over the past 2 years the Diversity Scholarship Fund with member and individual support that's helped to bring, I think this past year it was 7 people to the TPAC meeting. And all of that is to recognize that standards are only as good as the inclusive community that helps to make them.
So I just realized we're already at 12:30. I apologize about that. I'm sure everybody would like lunch. So let me ask one final question, which is, what can the folks here do to get involved with your communities? What can, if you were going to leave them with one directive to come participate and get involved, what would you ask them or tell them to do?
So I think it's also interesting to look at this from the perspective of, because I don't think, I think one place, okay, so context. I ran a survey last year about asking developers what their relationship with TC39 was and how they wanted to participate. And that actually shed a lot of light because from our perspective, it was that everybody wanted to do proposals and everybody wanted to propose a change to the language, get a feature in. But from the survey, it became clear that a lot of people were like, well, actually, I want to help, but I'm not too sure how or where I can start from. I would love to write tests. So in the case of TC39, you can check out our test 262 repository on TC39's GitHub page. And there are lots of really friendly people there who will help you get started with writing tests. Other people were saying that they wanted to help with documentation. And people were also saying, I would love to give feedback, but I don't know how. And we haven't fully addressed this yet. We're trying to get some documentation together. This is something that we're actively working on to help people know how to give feedback and what we're looking for and things like this.
I'd say two places to get engaged. Any of our review groups, if you're interested in security or privacy or accessibility or internationalization. We have reviews on all of those, and we're always looking for people to help in doing those so-called horizontal reviews. And if you have technical proposals or places you think the web could do better, check out the strategy funnel where we collect ideas and proposals and see either vote something up that's already in there or add an idea to the mix.
I would say the easiest way to get involved in the IndieWeb community is join the chat channel. It's available on IRC, Slack, Matrix, and Discord. All are the same room. It's chat.indieweb.org. Come to an IndieWeb camp, meet people in person, and start talking about what you're interested in and what specs you're willing to help develop or build things with. It's a very friendly community, very welcoming, and a lot of places to, we have an IndieWeb camp coming up this weekend in New York and in 2 weekends in Brighton. So lots of opportunities to join.
I'd say for the W3C, the YCG or WICG Web Incubator Community Group is an interesting one to join if you have ideas and to see what ideas are coming in from the community generally. You can just join the mailing list and get the emails from that. The other thing is start talking or speaking at events. So that's what I did. I actually started being a bit of a fan person for service worker. I kind of really locked onto that very early on. And it was because of the explainer document, actually, that Wendy referenced earlier. Alex Russell wrote this explainer document, and I started talking about that and the work that was happening there. Also, just reach out to somebody on Twitter or another social media platform. There are some people in standards who are desperate for people to help. So just do that mental thing and just reach out to them and say, I want to work on this. They will be so happy. So that's my tips.
And I want to share two quick references. The WebCompat work from Mike Taylor's group is a great place to go check out how you can sort of get involved with like spec bugs and things like that. And the other one is oh my gosh, the Web We Want is another great place that's collecting ideas for gaps in the platform. So.
Just one last thing about TC39. If you're interested in, if you just want a starting place that will give you lots of resources, TC39's website, tc39.es, has our contributing doc and other things if you want to take a look.
All right, we're out of time. So thank you all so much for your questions and continue.
Thank you.